Good evening.
Sure sounds pretty good.
Welcome, everyone, to the League of Women Voters Bridging the Divide, our civic forum to address barriers to racial reconciliation. Reconciliation, what a concept. What does it mean to be reconciled? Well, we will spend some time tonight and discuss and examine some rather difficult topics, and we hope that everyone has brought their open minds and open hearts and humility, and we are looking forward to being not just enlightened, but hopefully a little disturbed. A little disturbed. If we were all in agreement and we all knew and understood everything that was going on and was being spoken of, then would not necessarily be an enrichment. But by us all being here together this evening, people that are interested in finding out where we can find common ground to address some of the serious issues that our country is facing these days. The League of Women Voters is committed to defending democracy. And so, although we are a political organization, we are nonpartisan. Our politics is about the issues, and the way that we approach them is in such that people can be included, people can feel that they have a voice, people can know that we are providing input to a system that we can make work for everyone. And so we are glad that you are with us this evening. We will start by our tradition in civics of pledging allegiance to our flag. If you all would stand, please. Our flag is here to my left. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty, justice for all. Liberty and justice for all is our goal. And so you may have heard, you may recall, that Jesus and Abraham Lincoln made these words famous: a house divided. It was first in the Christian Bible in all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The words of Jesus were recorded where he said, "How is it that you say I cast out demons in the name of a demon?" That's illogical. That doesn't make sense. So if you are making that statement, that's a house divided against itself. A house divided against itself. That's illogical. Later, when Abraham Lincoln, in 1958, a couple years before the Civil War, used those words, he was trying to convince his fellow citizens of this coming conflict. This was 3 years before the war. When Abraham Lincoln gave this speech, which is known as one of his greatest speeches, he lost that election. He lost. It was quite a chore to convince his peers of the time that our country could not continue half slave and half free. But he lost that election, but as we know, that was foreshadowing of what was to come. And so the house divided that they spoke of those many years ago presents similar circumstances for us these days, because we see the conflicts, we see the chaos, and we see the confusion. And because we're concerned citizens that want to preserve our democracy and make sure that it is here for the next generations, then we have to do something. And one of the first things that we do is to just be aware. And becoming aware is an educational process. We go from awareness to acknowledgement, because we know that you cannot solve a problem that you can't acknowledge, that you won't acknowledge. All of us know that syndrome. We have lived our lives. We know that there are times when there's a problem, but let it go untreated or unaddressed, and it won't just go away on its own. Wishful thinking will not fix the problem. And so Abraham Lincoln and Jesus give us a great model for how we are and where we are today. So we're going to start by playing a short video, and this is from, well, before we play the video, I'm sorry. As I said, we know about the divisions, the political circumstances from the election of 45 to the election election of 44 to the election of 45. Accusations of election fraud after our most secure election with a record turnout during a pandemic, which has a disparate impact on low-wage workers, the pandemic, who are disproportionately minority. Of course, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, along with the 2020 election and what we know as the big lie of January 6th, and that fact that civics education that incorporates history through a different racial lens is currently being banned. Why are there things we don't want people to learn about American history? We are who we are. We can't change history. We can only learn from it. But unless we take the lessons from the history, then it will be challenging for us to move forward. So we are going to watch a short video, learning to talk about race. And this is a video that is brought to us by the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Talking about race. And so many of you may have heard about the author that is featured, or the educator that is featured here today, and her name is Robin DiAngelo. She is the author of the book called White Fragility, and she is going to give us a few minutes on deconstructing white privilege.
I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men, I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power. And so prior to the civil rights movement, it was fairly socially acceptable for white people to just come out and say, we are superior. My father certainly was comfortable saying that. The great joke of Archie Bunker and all of the family was that he wasn't up with the times and he was still saying things that conveyed this idea. But post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist, right? It became unacceptable to be racist. And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism's bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue. In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity and how it shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives, I've had the very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script, right? That like, it's almost as if as white folks, we just pick up this script and we say the same things again and again and again. And as a sociologist, rather than seeing something that's patterned as meaning therefore it's true, I look at something patterned as very revealing of how we get socialized to see things and to see the world. And then the next question that follows that is, and so how does that function? Right? And when we look around us, we can see that although we have changes since the civil rights movement and we have this idea of racism being bad, we still have the same unequal outcomes by race. By every measure, we have racial inequality. So how do we have such different narratives than we had prior to the civil rights movement and still have unequal outcomes?
We'll get back to listening to Robin a little bit later, but I did want to call you all's attention at this time to your booklets and the information that's contained here, because what we want to do is have some individual table conversations. We want to have some conversations. And so we sent the guidelines. Most of you probably received them from us in advance. Because we wanted everyone to be clear about what we are doing here this evening. And we expect that everyone, of course, is respectful, that you understand this is a dialogue and not a debate. In a debate, we're seeking agreement, whereas in a dialogue, we're seeking understanding. So again, we want people to be open and honest and willing to share with those around your table. This is not, these conversations at your tables are not something that we'll share with publicly or that you'll be reporting back in or anything like that. We just want people to have some conversations with other people that they don't know. So that was why we had you arranged the way that we did, so that you can speak with those who you may be unfamiliar with. We want to make sure that everyone is on the same page here in terms of what we are doing. We are not debating the issue of racism, or as I said, not a debate, but we are on a continuum to try to become anti-racist. And that is a long continuum. We do believe that for most of us, this is a life journey. And so for this particular moment on your journey, we hope that it is something that will be different from what you have experienced in the past. So we want to ask the first question of the groups to discuss. And the question that we want you all to discuss casually among yourselves is simply this: how were you made aware of, or what was your own orientation to the issue of race? The issue of race. And we're going to have a limited amount of time, so please make sure that everyone at the table participates and that no one dominates the conversation. We don't have a lot of time, okay? So we want to take about 10 minutes or so just for everyone to share that information. Okay, let's pick it back up here in just a few moments. For those that were not able to finish, we do want to move on. Now, one thing I want to point out for you in your booklets, when we talk about politics, politics is all about power. Power, authority. Who has it, how they got it, what they do with it, what people will do if they don't have any or don't feel that they have any power. And in your booklets, you'll see that there are some examples of different types of power. One of my favorite political scientists in 1936 gave the definition of politics as who gets what, when, and where. Leaves out most of the why. That's the interesting part. Why is power divided the way it is? But that is something that is the crux of our division. It's a power struggle. And so we are looking at ways to acknowledge that difference and to begin to recognize how to shift a balance. But in our next segment, we're going to have our league member, Mr. Scott Clemens. We'll make a presentation here on woke culture.
Thank you, Shelley. I think for years, we've all in some way or another grappled with differences in race. And somehow the way we talk about that, we view that, has somehow become so much more challenging now. And I remember, and I'm fairly politically aware, I try to watch the news, I try to educate myself and everything. I remember when I first started hearing the term woke, and maybe I was late along the way, I wasn't aware as I should have been when I started hearing the term. I thought I knew what it was, but frankly, after a while I had to go look at the definition to make sure I knew what people were talking about. So even preparing for this, I thought, well, let me go back and look and make sure what I see as woke is what other people agree is the accepted definition. So you'll see that one definition, they're very similar, is alert to injustice in society, especially racism, or well-informed and aware in a cultural or political sense. So I don't know if is that consistent with your view of what woke is? I think so. And so when I hear that, but then I watch the news and I hear the way the term woke is used, it's developed such a negative connotation. And I guess that just may go to the issue that we're now in such a political divide that people are going to find ways to color your comments and your views in a way that is very damaging or negative to you. And so I get very frustrated with that. And I guess when I was trying to reason through that, I saw that little definition there, and where it said, because I was still grappling with why can that be a bad word? But it's viewed by some as shorthand for left-wing ideas involving identity politics. And so that it means, well, I don't like the views you're progressing. What they're accusing us of doing is saying, well, you're just trying to distract people, so you want to talk about being woke or talk about racism and dwell on identity politics, as though that's a bad thing. That's been very, very troubling to me. And so that's led us into this sort of spiral about how can you, in a civil way, talk about racism? Because I think, why should we, we're using these terms like critical race theory, and again, I had to look up the definition of that too. But it's just a discussion of why is this happening to us? And people are resistant to having that conversation. And the best presentation where I've ever heard was by General Milley in his presentation to Congress when he was asked about why those sort of that awareness was there in the military. So listen to this.
On the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders, now and in the future, do understand it. I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding, having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers, of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there. That was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look it, I do want to know. And I respect your service, and you and I are both Green Berets. But I want to know. And it matters to our military and the discipline and cohesion of this military. And I thank you for the opportunity to make a comment on that.
I wish every American could see that. It was a very compelling response. It was a rather flippant question to him, designed to sort of get under his skin, but I thought he handled it just beautifully. I think it's an important lesson we should all consider. By the way, let me take a moment of executive privilege. He was talking about a professor who was teaching critical race theory at the United States Military Academy. My nephew just got an appointment to the academies. He's going to be going to West Point next year. And I say that because I'm proud of him, but also it's nice to know that they're teaching that there when he gets there. In a moment, we're going to go back into our table discussions. We're going to talk about barriers to discussing racism and why we don't do things, what's holding us back. But as we lead into that, I want to tell you a personal story that I think, to me, sheds light on this. When I was telling the rest of my table here, I went to a small elementary school, private elementary school. Then I started going to public school when I got into 6th grade. And in the neighborhood that I grew up in the Cove, and there were some other families in town, other parts of town, who, all white, of course, who had put together a dance. So it started like my big sister was one of the groups that did it, and they would be the hosts and the host committee, and they would invite people to go to this dance. And it was all of 9th graders. So by the time I got to that age, and I think I was like 14 at the time. So I was the 4th kid in my family to be a part of that tradition, which is now going on today, is known as the Legacy Ball. Well, one little bit of background, I had gone to Jenks, and we were beginning to have more integration in Bay County, so they redistricted, so we went to Rosenwald. So there was some some tension in the air because it was a big change because Rosenwald had been considered a traditionally black school. So we go there, and the group of us, we're all proud. We're the kids of these families that put on this big dance, and the parents let us be very much in control of it. They had us in a room all together, and we're all in there kind of planning what we're going to do. And the subject came up about whether we were going to invite anybody who was black. And now we think, well, why does that discussion occur? But it occurred and unfolded right in front of me. And there was a very big argument about, somebody said, my boyfriend was in a fight, and this guy was so mean, this black guy was so mean to him. They ganged up, and they went on and on. There was these kind of things that were going on. And as the conversation was going on, Deanna White was one of my good friends. And she whispered to me, and she said, I can't believe this conversation is going on. And it was leaning towards not precluding any blacks from coming to the dance. And then she said, what about Tony? What about Ashley? These are kids that we got to know very well, and they won't be able to come. And I was listening to her. And you know what I did? Nothing. Nothing. I said nothing. I did nothing. And that bothered me for the longest time. And as years have gone by, that's really haunted me because I did what a lot of people in the United States do. I was just silent. I didn't do anything. So over time, I've tried to overcome that. So that was my barrier. I was a 14-year-old kid who wanted desperately to be popular and to be accepted by everybody. And that's why I didn't say anything, because I was fearful about how I was going to be perceived. But I'm older now, and I realize that as adults, we, in smaller ways, in different ways, we still face some of those same barriers, that same feeling about how people are going to react to us if we're not silent. So what we'd like you to do is to, in each of your tables, to talk about what are the barriers to openly discussing racial injustice and racial reconciliation.
Barriers. There are a number of barriers, and hopefully you all have addressed some of them in your table talks. Again, not enough time. In our 2 hours plus tonight, we could have entire sessions on any single one of these topics. And so this is kind of a lightning round, just of people being able to give some voice to the expressions about our conflicts. So we are going to continue on to talk about the awareness. Now, initially, as we said, we have to be aware before you can acknowledge, before you can take action. And one of our major barriers is that there really are people who just don't know. Just don't know. And while many are by choice choosing not to know, there are also many good-minded, good-hearted, open-minded people who have not had the exposure. So one of the things that we want to do in disrupting is to encourage people to find out. You got to find out. If you don't know, you better ask somebody. If you don't know, there's not a good reason for you to stay in the dark. If you don't know, it's because you don't want to know these days, because if you're paying attention, you have lots of anxiety about what's going on around us. And so while we try to minimize and manage that anxiety, it is important that we take the opportunity to fill the gaps. And in our own journeys, in our own understanding, we find that there are a number of things that, yeah, we need to know. We need to know. So one of the barriers that will now be addressed by Janice Lucas is fear of knowledge. Fear is a major barrier. What might happen if you know? What might happen? And so we are going to turn it over to Janice Lucas.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelley. Good evening. A lot of familiar faces in the room and very invigorating conversation. So thank you all for coming and participating with us this evening. So right here at Gulf Coast State College, I was on the faculty from 1987 to 1998. Born and raised right here in Panama City, born over at Bay Memorial, which became Bay Medical, which has become Ascension something. And in the year of my birth, November 1961, we were a segregated society. So that I would attend, much less become a professor at Gulf Coast, then community college, was not in the realm of thought at that time. During my tenure here, I had the opportunity to teach African American literature, the first African American literature course taught here. It was in 1993. It was a special topics course. You see, it was not part of the literary canon. It could not count as literature credit. It could be extra credit. So special topics in literature included African American literature, women in literature, film and literature, and other topics that the professors might want to advance. So I would have to wait for my round to come, to teach African American literature, because they weren't all offered every semester. I left the college, left the town, moved back here in 2001, became an adjunct, and what do you know? An awakening had happened. The college was woke. African American literature had become a course that could count for credit as one of your literature humanities courses, as was Women in Literature and other courses that had been special topics courses. And so when I first taught it, I had to choose a textbook. I couldn't find a textbook. This textbook for the first course was African American Literature. It's a high school textbook, right? Got nice artwork and big letters, right? Because it's for high school. The older you get, the more degrees you get, the smaller the print gets. And the harder it is to understand. So when I came back, by that time, the Norton Anthology of African American Literature had been produced because there was a movement happening at the collegiate level in the academy. So the first book was just one, right? This is one Choke a Horse anthology. And then as it progressed, it became two anthologies, chronologically. So I taught from an historical perspective with a facilitative approach to literature that was designed for the students to come to understanding what was there. Because, in many literature courses, you have to know what the author intended. Well, this particular course, we brought a lot of stuff, right? So there had to be a space and a place to go through that. And I'll tell you this short story, then we're going to look at a clip called Truth Be Told, because that's essentially what was happening here. Sometime before the storm, I was at a Voices Against Violence forum, and this woman had come for the first time, and I told her that night about my African American literature course that was starting the next day or two. She went, registered as when you're just taking the course, audit, thank you. I'm of that age where words just go away. But with friends like you, I don't worry. And she's here tonight, Judy Stapleton. I just want to give a shout out to Judy for being on the journey even before everybody else in America was. So with that, Truth Be Told is a campaign to address the fear
Killings
of
of
knowledge.
George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery catalyzed an unprecedented worldwide mobilization, activating tens of millions of Americans of all races to demand institutional accountability and reform. As these images spread across the world, the right scrambled for a way to snuff out this transformative energy. And they think they found it by orchestrating a repressive censorship campaign. In Arizona, Idaho, Texas, Georgia, we are seeing school boards attempting to rewrite curriculums, teachers getting fired for educating their students about racial disparities, and potentially an entire generation being fed lies about American history. Make no mistake, what we are seeing now is a calculated backlash to last year's summer of racial reckoning. The right is going to try to convince you that we need to ban critical race theory, intersectionality, structural racism, implicit bias, diversity training, and the 1619 Project. But understand that this organized, well-funded, and coordinated campaign isn't an honest debate about these ideas. Most couldn't even define what these ideas are. And that's the point. They want to scare and silence our society back to colorblind submission, where George Floyd and Black people's killability is just a natural, everyday feature of American life, unproblematic, unchangeable, and disconnected from the history of anti-Black racism. From the criminalization of abolitionist literature to the McCarthy-era witch hunts, we've seen the government respond to liberatory movements through the repression of anti-racist ideas time and time again. If you are concerned about these efforts to censor history, to muzzle anti-racist speech, to expand voter suppression, and to criminalize protest, we urge you to join us in standing up for racial justice. We need to fight back like our lives depend on it, because they do.
We in America have the option to opt out, right? That's one of the freedoms. But what happens when 70, 80% of the people opt out? We change the basic construction of the way we operate in this country. And so that's why we need more opportunities like this for us to talk together and to know together. These two books are about Bay County. One is about the county itself, and the other is about Millville. There's a press that puts out these books, and people can write them. Now, there's a third book about St. Andrews, and in St. Andrews, it includes a little segment about the Hill, the African-American community. There's very little in these books about the history of Bay County or Millville that isn't white-specific, white-centered, right? So this is part of what we're doing here tonight. It's not rewriting. We're not trying to change the story, but get more of our stories included when we say Bay County, Panama City, and so forth. That same publishing company will do the Black America series. So from Alachua County, from Tallahassee, Florida, you can find it if you look. And now it's even more, they're out there even more books. We have some on display here. But sometimes we just need a succinct, like, what's the history? What is it that we don't want to know? And a few years ago, I had the opportunity, again, before the storm, we went to Montgomery, to the Lynching Museum, and to the African American History Museum there. Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative, in this clip gives us a depth of understanding in a short amount of time. So, if you would.
Like Wilmington and Tulsa and so many others have faded so overwhelmingly from our collective memory, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, in many ways, I don't think we've ever created narratives about Wilmington and Tulsa and much of our history that have been given to the American people. Most Americans, I'm going to even suggest all Americans, walk around with a false narrative of who we are, of what this country is. It's what we were taught in school. It is a narrative of greatness, it is a narrative of achievement, but it is false because it is incomplete. We are a nation that is also a post-genocide society. What happened when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We killed millions of indigenous people through famine and war and disease. We created a narrative of racial difference. We said that those indigenous people, those native people, they're savages. And we used the rhetoric of that narrative to disconnect from their well-being, their humanity. And we created a constitution that talked about equality and justice, but didn't extend to the millions of native people who were dying. And we used that narrative of racial difference to then get comfortable with 2.5 centuries of slavery. We are a slave society. They had slavery all over the world, and in most countries, they were societies with slaves. America actually became a slave society. We created a narrative that made slavery about race. And the great evil of slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude, it wasn't the forced labor, it was this idea that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less human, less capable, less evolved. And that narrative of white supremacy, that was the true evil of American slavery. The Civil War comes and the North wins the Civil War, but the South wins the narrative war because that idea of racial hierarchy, of white supremacy continues. Even some abolitionists didn't believe in racial equality. And that's why I've argued that slavery doesn't end in 1865, it just evolves. We passed the 13th Amendment that talks about ending involuntary servitude and forced labor, but says nothing about ending this racial hierarchy. It's why Reconstruction fails, is because we weren't committed to a narrative of equality. And lawlessness then defines the 20th century. Black people pulled out of their homes, beaten, drowned, tortured, tormented, lynched, sometimes on the courthouse lawn. Our Supreme Court did nothing. Our Congress did nothing. Our policymakers did nothing. We were a nation in the first half of the 20th century that gave in to lawlessness. And that created this mass exodus. And the Black people who went to Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And then we had the Civil Rights Movement, but even there, the narrative was corrupted. It was a false narrative. We had courageous people who did courageous things, but that narrative of racial difference was never confronted. The presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned in Black and brown people was never really addressed. So after the Civil Rights era, when we passed the Voting Rights Law and the Civil Rights Law, we had the same phenomena happening that we had after the Civil War, retreat from enforcement. And then we created this new institution of mass incarceration, over-incarceration. And at the beginning of the 21st century, we're hearing from the Justice Department that 1 in 3 Black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison, and no one responds. We don't react to that with a kind of pandemic level of concern. And our jails and prisons fill up, and Black people are shot and killed on the streets by the police, and people are confused why there's such anger and frustration. So the narrative of America that we need to confront is a narrative we've never been forced to confront. And so the challenge we have is, will we find the courage to do this? Because in other countries where this has happened, South Africa, Germany, there was a tremendous shift in power. Black South Africans took over. That's why you had Truth and Reconciliation. In Germany, the Germans lost. That's why there's a Holocaust memorial in Berlin. And the consequence of that shift in power has yielded something that I think is powerful. When you go to Berlin, there's a reckoning with the legacy of the Holocaust. You couldn't, I don't believe, succeed too long by talking about make Germany great again, by invoking some romanticized vision of the it would not be acceptable to the world to have that. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. It would be unconscionable for someone to say, let's honor the architects of the Third Reich. But in this country, I live in Alabama, surrounded by the iconography of the Confederacy, where we honor and romanticize the defenders, the perpetrators of this violence. And those images that many of those folks took to Washington on the 6th is an indictment of our failure collectively to tell the honest story. And Hollywood and storytellers and filmmakers are implicated in that, because it was a generation of cowboy and Indian films that kept us away from dealing with the Native genocide. It was a century of storytelling that made slavery somehow romantic and benign and put Black people in roles that we were led to believe they were happy to be enslaved and marginalized and disenfranchised. It was even in the storytelling of civil rights that we had to create white saviors to kind of get those stories palatable. So I think that's the challenge that we face. We've got to confront this. And that's why I believe, we're really at a moment when we need an era of truth and justice. And that's the challenge that I think awaits this country. And it's the reason why we had that explosion of lawlessness and mob violence on the 6th of January.
And so that frames for us the discussion. I thought that Brian Stevenson did an excellent job of framing from yin to yang what it is that we have not faced about truth and justice in the country today. And so our question as we go now is for you to talk about how you began to learn about other cultures, other people, other history in this America that perhaps was not the stories, narratives taught to us in school. So that's our question at the table. Was that formal or informal in your experiences? Thank you.
All right, time is up. We're going to move ahead to our next topic. Our next barrier. We could talk about barriers all night long. We could talk about the divide all night long. But we are ready to move on to our next barrier, Mr. Peters. Equal justice under the law. Attorney Alvin Peters.
Great to be among so many friends this evening. It's wonderful. What can we do to challenge this particularly advanced group of racial scholars? I don't want to get in too much trouble, That's part of the whole racial dynamic of thinking. How do we stay out of trouble? Well, let's just take a chance. I mean, the experience of being a human being in America in the 21st century is different for each of us. But I would suggest to you that there's a difference between the experience a Black human being experiences in the United States in this time of era, at this time, and that of a white. There's just a difference out of experiences. Now, they say I'm 99% the same as a grain of rice. If you look at the genetic molecular structure of a grain of rice, we're about 99% the same. But I'm a little different from a grain of rice. So it must be that 1% or so that makes the difference, right? Between me and a grain of rice. So yes, there's a lot of commonality, but the difference, albeit percentage-wise relatively small, is, I would suggest, a huge difference between a human being and a grain of rice. So it's that difference that makes a difference in the experience. The chart in here that I want you to look at is the one that has to do with wealth. Because this is one of the most striking statistics in modern day America. And it's the inequities by the numbers. And what it does is it talks about net worth. What is the net worth of a Black family in America? The net worth of a Black family in America is about $10,000. If you take all the value of your house, your car, your savings and you subtract your credit cards and your mortgage, you get your net worth. And so the net worth of a typical family or the median family, black family in America is about $10,000. And the median net worth of a white family, if you take the house and the cars and the savings and you subtract the mortgage and the credit cards and the debt, is about $120,000. And so what you immediately learn is that white families have wealth. That also shapes how we all perceive each other. Because as we drive down the road or as we look at each other, we're sizing each other up. What are you wearing? How do you speak? What's in your bank account? What do you do with yourself? And so that is one of the immediate criteria that we all look at and internalize and understand as we go through life. In the back of this book, very well done, Shelley, I must say, very well done, is your reading list, right? You know, if you want to learn without embarrassing yourself, you can learn privately. And these books are great ways to learn privately. But I would suggest that you start with one of them in particular, which Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. And what he does so successfully in that book is he'd say, you know, have you ever noticed, for example, conversations with black people about race, where do they begin? Somewhere in a slave ship, okay? Somewhere talking about history. Every time you get into a conversation with people on a cross-racial basis, talking about racism, what do you hear? History. What happened, 75 years ago? What happened 100 years ago? What happened 300 years ago? And what is the common response from white people? I wasn't there. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. And so that's where you start to think, well, what are they talking about with this systemic racism? What are they talking about when we talk about structural systems that determine outcome? Because in the white vocabulary, right, it's personal responsibility. Did you do it? Did you do it? Did you do it? Who did it? And that sense of personal responsibility and accountability is what you hear white folks talking about. You also hear white folks say, I wasn't there. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. But in this book, Kendi really does tie in with what Brian Stevenson was speaking to us about, which is that slavery ended, right? And white people will tell you, look, I wasn't there. Slavery's over. Get a job. Pull up your pants. Make something of yourself. But what Kendi explains is that slavery, the bondage may have ended, but the justification for slavery never did. And so the stereotypes of black racism, anti-black racism, are still with us. What are the stereotypes of anti-black racism? The most predominant one that we talk about today is criminality, right? As white people wander through the universe, what are the stereotypes that we engage in that are anti-black? We engage in a stereotype basically of criminality. The ones that came out of the slavery era were hypersexuality, criminality, ignorance or stupidity, and those were the common stereotypes. And what Kendi's challenging us to do is to be anti-racist. Take steps in our individual lives that not only make us neutral, but cause us or require us to take steps that are anti-racist. There's this whole conversation about, white people are somehow victimized by race, right? We live in this political era now where over half of the white people maintain that they are victimized. I mean, that really is essentially what we saw on January 6th. That's what we saw in the last election. We are looking at white people who have grown up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s who feel that they are the victims of race. The Supreme Court has said in the Shelby decision, look, race no longer really matters when it comes to voting rights. So we're going to repeal Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so we're hearing this all across the political spectrum, that white people are the victims. Because why? Well, I'm not really exactly sure what the logic is, but it's clear that white people feel like they've been treated unfairly. Maybe there was some affirmative action that somehow existed marginally, in the 70s or the 80s. But white people are not comfortable with the Black Lives Matter concept. And that, essentially, white folks are looking at that saying, why are you diminishing me? My life matters just as much as your life matters. But that assertiveness of saying that Black Lives Matter, that Robert E. Lee should not have his statue in the Charlottesville, place of honor, it is forcing us to consider a different attitude about history and about how we govern, our society. And that is uncomfortable for a lot of white folks. You want to watch a little video? Okay.
So we'll watch a few moments of the brief history of the
It has been incredibly difficult to prosecute a police officer successfully.
I'm here because I'm sick and tired of seeing black men and women being killed and nothing be done about it.
We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
Jonathan Farrell was unarmed when he died, just a month shy of his 25th birthday.
Now that officer, Randall Carrick, is charged with voluntary manslaughter.
A mistrial was declared in a case of a white police officer who shot and killed an unarmed black man. There were protests outside the court after the mistrial was announced Friday.
Don't shoot! Unarmed! Don't shoot! Unarmed! Don't shoot!
Death of Eric Garner of a heart attack on Thursday. The father of 6 can be heard on the tape saying repeatedly,
I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
Needs to be prosecution. That's what this is all about.
Many people simply cannot understand why the grand jury did not indict when they could actually see video of what went down between that New York police officer and Eric Garner.
Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old, was shot and killed during a struggle with a Ferguson police officer.
Officer Darren Wilson will not be indicted.
It's the feeling among many of these people that black lives don't matter. Not one reason that this grand jury finds to indict him.
Ask a question.
Yes.
How can we be promised that this injustice will happen again to another black kid?
In another state tomorrow.
How can we assure our kids that they're safe out of your office?
That's my
That's
question.
what I want to know. I have a black child.
Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke shot and killed 17-year-old Laquan McDonald.
For the first time in 35 years, a Chicago police officer is charged with first-degree murder.
That officer found guilty of second-degree murder. Very unusual, very important.
It just goes to show you how serious that I am about my life and all these other lives that are out here that are scared of the police.
An officer shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice on Sunday.
Tamir Rice was playing with a pellet gun when officers arrived. One of them opened fire within 2 seconds.
Grand jury decided not to indict the 2 officers who shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice.
Cleveland's prosecutor calls it a tragedy, but not a crime.
Doesn't even warrant a trial. That in my mind, is unacceptable.
Think of the death of Freddie Gray.
All lives matter, but you got to think about who's dying out here.
Prosecutors in Baltimore dropped all remaining charges against 3 police officers in the Freddie Gray case.
Samuel DuBose was shot in the head Sunday after being pulled over for a missing license plate.
Officer Raymond Tensing has now been charged with murder and voluntary manslaughter.
The only reason why Tiffany's being charged is because there was a body cam. Yeah.
Now those charges have been dismissed.
We will never get a conviction in this case.
the death of Alton Sterling,
African-American man killed by police in Louisiana.
The Louisiana Department of Justice cannot proceed with a prosecution.
All we want is the same justice that they put against us whenever we go through certain trials and tribulations.
Philando Castile, a supervisor at a school cafeteria where kids loved him.
Police officer Geronimo Yanez shot Castile to death while he was in the car with his girlfriend and her 4-year-old daughter.
Jurors found Yanez was reasonable in his decision to shoot and kill Philando Castile.
That's what we heard in 2014 with
all of those, hang on, Sonia, all those stories are so powerful in their individual ways, but when you start to pile them up and watch them and think of all the families and then think of even more families who have just, like Eric Davis in Jacksonville, whose mother's now a congressman, was killed basically by a white guy who was mad because his music was too loud. And when I started getting ready for this, I watched Walter Scott, the middle-aged black man who was pulled over in his Mercedes-Benz in South Carolina, didn't want to go to jail on a child support warrant and ran away from a police officer and was shot 8 times. And that, just a disturbing video to watch. And then I brought up the Castile story to the Bay High basketball girls. Came by the other day to raise money. I took the opportunity to tell them the story of that, because too often when I'm watching these videos, I watch the female partner essentially sort of like create more drama in the police-male encounter, and it really endangers the life of everybody. And so, just took that opportunity to say, be careful what you say in those encounters, because if you're not careful, it can lead to violence by police officers. And so, the first thing is to save your own life and save the life of your partner, and then the second thing to do is to try to change the system so that people are not responding, or police officers are not responding with that level of violence and fear. This process of the rules, though, leads me to one of the greatest challenges that I think we don't address as a nation, which is the right wing, says we don't want to talk about police killings. We want to talk about black-on-black crime. And you remember that discussion from the last go-round after Floyd? And so, how do we, as hopefully a mature democracy, start to be able to address both issues, right? Yes, we cannot have a government that uses agents of law enforcement to kill people, except under the most dire circumstances. But we also cannot tolerate a nation that allows so many young African-American men to be killed. And it's a pandemic on massive proportions that we need to be able to address, and to do so in a mature way. So I see Earl shining the red card at me, but that is, I would suggest to you, as you go into your dialogue, talk about those challenges. How do we address both challenges in a fashion that allows us to implement fair rules, laws? Thank you. Sonia, you had something to say?
First of all, the elephant in the room is this. When we look back at slavery, first of all with that, there were white men raping little girls, 18 years old, having babies by them. Okay, bring them, they worked at the house. Okay, we never talk about the pedophilia. Okay, it was an intentional breakdown of the family structure. Okay, that is prevalent today. When we look at the police brutality piece, okay, and we want to talk black on black crime and all that, but we see the category. But for over 150 years, if you had a drop of black blood, you were black, period. But now, politically, I need you to be biracial. Why? Because that works better for me in my power structure when I'm looking at, what are we looking at now? Even in our community, we're looking at redistricting, right?
Thank you for that comment. We do want to be able to have enough time for us to get through our program because as we discussed at the beginning of our program, we could spend any number of hours on aspects of this issue, and so we're doing a quick through on this now. So we do want to come back to our table talks about Black Lives Matter. That's what we talked about at the beginning, is how much we need these kinds of conversations, how much we need to continue, because we cannot get it all in one program or event. But it is a deep topic, and we do believe that all of it is valuable and educational for us. So our current question is about the retort to Black Lives Matter. Why a negative retort to Black Lives Matter? Black Lives Matter. That's a period, right? Why the retort? Because to make a statement in response to Black Lives Matter is in a sense to deny that fact. To need more to say after Black Lives Matter is part of the issues we've been talking about. It's part of the discriminatory way of looking at the value of various lives. So, for the next few minutes, why a negative retort to Black Lives Matter?
All right. So how much fun was that? Did any of that information surprise you guys? No, I don't see much surprises here. So I am Cherie Krim, and I am the lucky one that gets to talk about white privilege. And I think you guys can see I am white, so I think it fits pretty well for the conversation today. But we're going to go back to the video we started with, because it's important. She's got some more points in there that I think are going to help us going on with our discussion. So we're going to go on the video for about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to
civil rights movement and still have unequal outcomes. And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself. I don't see color, I was taught to treat everybody the same, I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted, my parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist, or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it, the answer is always, I'm not racist, I know people of color, I used to work in the military. All of the things we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now I want to speak to 2 of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I am just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. Okay? And that's why I have this image of a dock, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water. You see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface. Okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color. Okay? And so we're giving you evidence, right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same. But we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences because racism is real. Fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then
no, it did not. All right, so if you guys know, she was talking about all the things underneath. And this right here, the new racism, the binary, this right here is what has us stuck. You guys see it, right? Because racist equals bad, not racist equals good. And so you have all of these things that we put there. So if somebody thinks they're racist, or you say that they were saying something that's racist, what do they think of themselves? They're bad, right? So I have to say this out loud. Good people say racist things, and they don't mean to do it. They may just not know any better. And that's a hard thing for us to always realize, because we're very progressive, a lot of people here in this room, and we think openly. But if you've been taught your whole life something one way, that's all you know until somebody helps correct you. And I know we were talking about having those hard conversations. So this right here is what is getting us stuck, especially here when we talk about race, because nobody wants to be in that bad category. But the good category means you're Northern, you're progressive, and nobody wants to be progressive either, right, I guess? I don't know. You have a little issue there. So the new racism, the binary, this is where we're stuck at, okay? So would you want to be told if you said something that was racist? You would, okay. Well, how would you want to be told? Gently. see, that's a really good way there, and it's interesting. So, gently. What other way? Do you want somebody to take you to the side and say something, or do you want somebody to just confront you straight face on? Right? It all depends on the situation, right? And so it's hard to know that we have to step in and have these hard conversations. So I had a very long conversation with Alvin's wife, Cecile, about my privilege and about what happens when we are in these situations where people are saying discriminatory things. And the fact of the matter is that myself as a white person, we've been taught that it is up to the oppressed person to be the one to speak up. Because if you're not offended, why should I be? And that's a really hard fact that we have, because it's true. We always are if we're with somebody and something negative is said, do you want to be that person to step up if they weren't offended? You think that in your head, but we can't. We have to use our superpower, which I call is a superpower, of kindness, of taking that person to the side and having that conversation with them, even though you might not be the one that was offended, right? But we should be offended. We should all be offended by the discriminatory things. But if it wasn't specifically said about you, sometimes we just don't think that way. So it's, as a white privileged piece, it is up to us to stand up to all of those discriminatory things and to be able to have those discussions. So, speaking of white privilege, we got another video.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. just as I'm standing there, trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, "Excuse me, why are you doing this?" And the checker goes, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that?" She goes, "Well, this is our policy." She goes, "No, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me." "Oh, well, I know you've been," she goes, No, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the two white elderly ladies go, "Oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. And it's totally unacceptable." At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, "Is there a problem here?" And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, "Yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened." So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, "This is unfair. Why are you doing this to me?" Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
Very true. So, I recently pushed my white privilege really far. I didn't realize what I was doing when I did it. But who here, if you get pulled over by the police, are you afraid to move and you just leave your hands on the steering wheel and you wait until the cop comes up to the car? Right? Okay, so this is me in my convertible driving down the road on 98. I'm going 50 and a 45. So I know he can't be pulling me over because I'm only going 5 miles over the speed limit, right? No. So I'm driving. I really didn't think he was coming after me. But if he was, I wasn't going that fast. So I'm going to go to my original destination, which was Ace Hardware. So I didn't pull over to the first street. I went a good quarter mile down the road before I pulled over. But I wanted to see. I really did want to see. So when it came down to it, did I stop? No, I literally am reaching into my purse, getting my stuff, not paying attention, just doing it. I'm still doing that while he's walking up to the car. No issues, no telling me to stop, looking through anything, right? And I hand it to him. I said, "Here's everything you need." He's like, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" I said, "Well, it couldn't be for speeding. I was only going 50 and a 45. And he's like, "No, you were going 51. I was like, "Okay, that's really nice." But when it was said and done, I did everything the way that I was doing it, and I walked away with no ticket, no warning, nothing. He just told me to slow down. That's privilege. And I didn't honestly, when I kept going, I was like, what's gonna happen? What's the worst that can happen? And see, that's my privilege, that I could actually do that. So I just wanna put that out there, that I know that, and now I've been watching for a very long time, anybody who gets pulled over, just to make sure that we're doing the right thing here. So, alrighty, so what is a Karen? That is, quickly, I know we're gonna watch this video, but let me just give you a quick definition, because, so we somehow, all of a sudden, children are using the word Karen for everything. So they're calling their moms Karens just because, is what I'm learning out there today. But a Karen really does have, it is associated with the kind of person who demands to speak to a manager in order to belittle service industry workers, and it carries out racist microaggressions such as asking to touch black people's hair, if they ask. That's always a fun thing as well. But a predominant feature of a Karen stereotype is that they weaponize their privilege against people of color. For example, when making police complaints against black people for minor or even in numerous cases, fictitious infringement, just like walking your dog. How many videos have you seen out there of a white woman saying she's calling the cops because a person's walking their dog who's not white in their neighborhood? I've watched too many of them at this point. I think I need to stop. So, with that being said, Shelley?
I'm sorry, I'm in the ramble, and there is a man, African American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African American man. I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking pictures calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me?
The messaging aimed at her has been, quite significant. And some of the messaging, I am told, has been death threat. And that is wholly inappropriate and abhorrent and should stop immediately. I think her apology is sincere. I'm not sure if in that apology she recognizes that while she may not be or consider herself a racist, that particular act was definitely racist.
All right, so using white privilege for good, and don't be a Karen. But it really comes down to, if you do see something like that happen, do talk to somebody. Go talk to the person if you see that they're overreacting because they're just scared. And I don't that's the type of thing. It's the middle of the day. The only reason she could be scared is because of the color of the skin, right? And that's the sad part.
All right, thank you, Cherise. And by the way, that Christopher Cooper refused to participate in the prosecution of Amy Cooper. He was not trying to, hold her. Obviously, her public notoriety was enough consequence for her indiscretion there. So that is an excellent lesson. Of course, ways that white supremacy is used for good and then ways in which it is used for harm. So, reconciliation. Again, what does it mean? What does it look like? And we hear the term a lot lately, not just in response to talking about racial reconciliation, but you may have heard a lot about reconciliation as a means to get to solving problems in the United States legislature. Reconciliation. As we know, there's quite a bit of conflict there and things have stalled, but this is the nature of democracy, and it's why we know that democracy has to continually be worked on. It's every generation has to redefine what it means for our democracy to work as we want it to. So, what does racial reconciliation look like? We don't have time for another table talk here, but we will, at this point, go on to our last presenter. I see has arrived. Mayor Jesse Nelson, the newly elected mayor of Lynn Haven, who is a positive representative for us, positive representation of how far we have in fact, come with race in America. We know we've made many strides. There's been tremendous gains, and here locally we have our colleague here, Mayor Nelson, who is also the senior pastor at Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church, and so brings a wealth of knowledge, information, and experience to close out our session this evening by speaking on empathy and the lack of empathy as a barrier to racial reconciliation.
Thank you, Ms. Shelley. Good to see everyone this evening. Sorry I have not been able to participate in all of this discussion. We had a city commission meeting tonight, and so I was making sure we could get through that agenda in time so I could get here in time. Thank you for the opportunity to come and share in this setting and in this forum. As Ms. Shelley mentioned, I do stand before you as an example of how far we have come with racial reconciliation, but it doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go. And when I say it as an example of how far we've come with racial reconciliation, you may not know it, but Lynn Haven is the whitest community in Bay County, or one of the whitest communities in Bay County. I don't mean it in a negative way. We have about 20,000 residents, and I'm using round numbers. We have about 20,000 residents. 85% of my residents are white. 85% of my residents are white, which means that if every black person voted for me, I still wouldn't win. And so whenever I started the campaign, I couldn't start it about race. I had to start it about what my platform would be and how it would be the best candidate to vote for, not about being the best black candidate to vote for. I didn't promote the fact that, hey, if you vote for me, I will be the first black elected mayor in Bay County. Now, Sheridan Sherfield was the first black mayor in Bay County, but she was appointed and not elected. And I'm not putting that down at all, but to say, hey, 20 years later, exactly 20 years later, I become the mayor of Lynn Haven after her 20-year appointment in 1992. Basically, 20 years later, she was in 91, and I become the mayor in 2021. So 20 years later, Lynn Haven elects its first black mayor. And so that is signs of how far we have come in Bay County, because I would not have won without relationships. I would not have won without the support of everyone, the biracial, Asian support, blacks, whites. So it took everyone in the community to come together in order for me to win, because it just wasn't the black vote. Because when you look back at the votes, I won by 29 votes, and out of those 29, and out of all the votes, it was maybe about, I think, like 1,200 votes, 300 were black. So that means that 900 plus white people had to vote for me, which in some sense means they had to look beyond the color of my skin. They had to look beyond my ethnicity, my culture, and had to look at me as a human being and saying, that's who I want to be my representative. That's who I want to be my voice at the table. And so I do stand before you as evidence that we have come a long way. Even this meeting is an example of how far we've come. 20 years ago, we were not sitting at Gulf Coast State College having meetings talking about these conversations. Certainly we have more conversations, as our sister mentioned, we certainly have more conversations that we have to have. Matter of fact, I made a presentation on that to Pastors United. I don't think any of those guys are in here, but I made a presentation on that, on the victimization of black women, and went back to slavery and talked all through that. And I brought up a lady that was in Abbeville, Ms. Taylor, because I'm from Abbeville, and it was the fact that it could have actually been my grandmother that would have been her. And so that really touched me when I read her story. That's my hometown, is Abbeville, Alabama. And I said, man, that could have been my grandmother. So we are having some of those conversations, right? But we haven't had as many as we need to have. But when we talk about racial reconciliation, we talk about the barriers that we face in racial reconciliation. I think one of the barriers that we face, which is being identified, is empathy. And so I want to talk for a few moments just about why empathy is a barrier and how do we develop empathy for others. So why is empathy a barrier and how do we develop empathy for others? One of the reasons empathy is a barrier is because empathy is not sympathy. And it's like, well, that's obvious, right? We know empathy is not sympathy, but no, we don't understand that. That empathy is a barrier because empathy is not sympathy. See, sympathy allows me to relate to your life situation because I have a similar personal experience. No matter what my racial identity might be or my ethnic culture, if you've lost a mother, I can relate to that because I've lost a mother. And so we can relate to one another sympathetically. And so with sympathy, it's reactive. I don't have to wonder if I can relate to you. I don't have to wonder if I can share in that life experience because I can do that because of sympathy. But the problem with empathy is that empathy has to be proactive. I have to be intentional about trying to relate to you because empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is me trying to understand your life situation considering I've never had a personal experience with that. And so that's one of the reasons that we have a barrier to racial reconciliation is because we can't really understand one another's life experiences because we haven't experienced it. And so empathy proves to be a barrier unless we're intentional and proactive about being empathetic with one another. And so empathy is not sympathy. That's why it's a barrier, because it's just not automatic. It's not something that's embedded in us that we can just be emotionally attached to because of life experience. Now, another issue with empathy is that empathy is also a barrier because empathy is two-sided. Empathy is two-sided. When I'm saying empathy is two-sided, it's the fact that when we talk about racial reconciliation, it's not just for whites to try to be empathetic with blacks. Blacks also have to be empathetic with whites. What do you mean by that? What I mean is that whites usually say, I don't know. I didn't know that. I don't understand. So whites can't be empathetic because they're saying, I don't know, I don't understand. But then on the other side of that, blacks sometimes say, well, why don't they know? Right? So like when I leave a meeting like this, I go back and I engage with my black friends and I talk about the things that we've discussed, maybe some of the things we talked about from the round table that I've learned from the white ladies back there. And please excuse me, I'm from Alabama, so everybody's black and white, okay? There's no racial intent there, but I'm African American, Caucasian, everybody's just black and white. That's Alabama. Everybody's black and white. And so as we talk to the white ladies, I would go back and I would share some of the things I learned as we talked about the Black Lives Matter movement and things. And then I would maybe have a response from a black person and say, well, why didn't they know that? Because empathy is two-sided. And so then there proves a barrier because we don't want to engage in racial reconciliation sometimes because some of the whites feel as if they don't know enough to engage in racial reconciliation conversations, and some of the blacks are offended that the whites don't know anything about the black race and the black experience. So why don't the whites know black history? Because they never had to learn it. Why do blacks know black history? Because we lived it. And so empathy is a barrier because it's two-sided. So we have to be very proactive in trying to understand from both sides. So as whites, you have to be proactive in trying to understand the plight of blacks in America. But as blacks, and this is for us as black people, we gotta get this part about this empathy, is that a white person would never understand what it means to be black. No matter how much empathy is there. And so that's the part we have to realize as well, is that a white person would never fully understand what it means to be black in America. Right? Well, what do you mean by that? Well, I'm a man. Ms. Crumb's a woman. I'll never understand what it means to be a woman. No matter how much she explains it to me, no matter how much she shows me, no matter how much I study it and read about it, I will still never understand what it means to be a woman. And so, yes, these conversations are great, but we have to still walk with the idea and understanding that empathy is still a barrier because it's two-sided. And so we as blacks have to be empathetic towards whites, just like we're asking whites to be empathetic towards us. And so we have to say, hey, I need you to understand me just like I need to try to understand you. So how do we develop this empathy then? If empathy is a barrier because it's not sympathy and because it's two-sided, then how do we develop empathy? How? I think it's H-O-W, yeah. So three words on developing empathy. First of all, is honesty. Is honesty. We have to admit what we don't know. See, empathy is still a barrier because everybody wants to say that we know and we understand when you really don't. We really don't understand and we really don't know. And so we have to be honest with that. So I hope tonight that you can be honest and say, hey, there's some things I don't understand. There's some things I don't know. And so until we're honest with ourselves, empathy is going to continue to be a barrier, and we're never going to bridge the gap for racial reconciliation because no one is going to listen to the other person because everyone is going to think they know. And everyone's going to think they understand because I read a book about it, because I watched a video on it, because I have a black friend, because I have a white friend. But we still don't know. And so we have to admit that. We have to be honest and say, hey, you know what, I don't understand, I don't know. And then that will break down one of the devices in us so that we can try to begin to understand, so that we can try to know. Because you have to try to know, you have to know what you don't understand so that you can understand what you don't know. And so after we admit honestly that we don't know, then we have to observe. We have to make observations. No, you have to. Well, how do you observe? It's easy. You just sit around and observe. When you go to the grocery store, make observations. See how this person in line is treated versus how this person in line is treated. Right? When you're at the park, make observations. See how does this white family react when this black kid walks up? Or how does this black family react when this white lady goes across them and goes into the beach? Observations. When you're at the bank, make observations. How are people treated when they're at the bank? Right? I mean, so as you're going through life, if you want to develop empathy and try to get an understanding, you have to open your eyes and begin to see the world that we really live in. But you have to make observations to try to see how is somebody else living their life. And try to see how people are treated in the way they live their lives. So after you're honest, after you start opening your eyes and making observations, then there's the W, right? H-O-W. There's the walk. I'm telling you, it doesn't. Now you have to try to walk in that other person's shoes. But here's the thing about trying to walk in somebody else's shoes is that you shouldn't try to do it by yourself. Right? My son, his foot is a little bigger now, but I remember when he was a kid, he would put his foot in my shoes and try to walk him and he'll fall. He'll stumble. So, do not, Ms. Crone, decide to walk in a black person's shoes and show up at Glenwood at 10:30 p.m. by yourself and walk through the neighborhood trying to walk in our shoes. Now, I'm not saying anything's going to happen to you. More than likely, they won't bother you because you're going to call the police. Right? And they will be arrested. So more than likely, nothing's going to happen to you. But what I am saying is that in walking in another person's shoes, sometimes you need help so that you can understand what you're actually doing as you're walking in their shoes. So try to walk in their shoes, but walk with someone as you're walking in those shoes, which requires you, if you're going to do this walking in someone else's shoes, it requires you to develop a genuine, open relationship with someone who lives in those shoes. It requires that. One of the running jokes that I have, and I remember I would tell this when I was campaigning, when people would sort of ask about my, because some people were worried, like, okay, what kind of black guy is this? That was part of it. What kind of black guy is he? Is he Black Lives Matter? Is he militant? Is he this? Is he that? I'm just Jesse Nelson. That's who I am. And so I would ease people's tension, especially when I was addressing white people. I would ease their tension by saying, my best friend is a Presbyterian elder. You got it. Because for those who know about the church, know that black people are not Presbyterian, for the most part. Not in the South. There are Stillman College is Presbyterian, so there are some black Presbyterians. But for the most part, Presbyterian is a white organization. It's a white religion, white denomination. And so they realized then that, okay, if your best friend is an elder in the Presbyterian church, he's a white guy. And then those Presbyterians are like really uptight white guys. We call them the chosen frozen, right? And so then they know that I don't have like the really cool, listening to rap music kind of white friend. I really have this really uptight kind of white friend. But we're best friends. And when I say we're best friends, when Hurricane Michael happened, he called me and said, "You want to come live with me?" And I did. I lived with him when I would travel back and forth to Dothan. I lived with him. And you know, I went to his house, and he has this big old house. And I wake up one morning, I'm like, "Where are my clothes?" And he was like, "Oh, the cleaning lady, I forgot her name. She's washing them." I'm like, "What are you doing?" Like, you know, you got a rich white friend, you know? And I would always tell him he was a rich white friend, and he would always deny it, although he went to like a private jet to go see Cam Newton play in the championship for Auburn and all that. And he was like, "No, I'm not rich, my dad's rich." I'm like, "Okay, well, you got the money too." But one of the things that it took our relationship to do in order to grow is that we had to be empathetic. We had to employ empathy in order to break down the barrier of racial reconciliation or the racial divide so that we could build a bridge for racial reconciliation because we had nothing in common. Matter of fact, I'm gonna tell you what brought us together, that brought us together. Jesus has kept us together, but he was getting to know me one night because his church was supporting a church that I was starting. I was a black guy starting a church. And so people were concerned about how I was using the money. Right? That's another one of those issues. They were concerned about how's the black guy using the money. My wife had got a new car. Oh boy, how's he using the money? And then once they ran the accounts, they realized they owed me more money than I had received because I was giving more than I was taking. But we were talking, and so we started talking about Dave Chappelle. You know, telling it wrong, telling it how it is goes wrong or something like that. That's right, when keeping it real goes wrong. So we stood in his Presbyterian church parking lot laughing about that. And that connected us because then we found a commonality. And then we began to talk and have a relationship. But in walking with one another, we begin to have honest relationship and honest dialogue. What do you mean by honest dialogue? I remember when President Barack Obama was getting, for his first inauguration, he called him and he said, "What's the big deal, man?" I said, "What do you mean, what's the big deal?" He says, "Why are people making a big deal about President Barack Obama using Martin Luther King Jr.'s Bible for his inauguration?" So then I explained to him what some of the issues might have been with that. And so then when I saw him, or whenever I saw a white guy doing something in the store, I would call him and say, "Hey man, what's the deal?" He's like, "What do you mean? I saw this white guy doing this. What does that mean?" And so we didn't get offended whenever we didn't understand, right? Because we had to be honest and say, "I don't understand." He didn't understand what it means to grow up in my shoes. I didn't understand what it means to grow up in Mountain Brook, Birmingham area. I didn't understand it. Right now, his mom is a state senator in Alabama, state representative. So we have nothing in common. He went to Auburn University, I went to Alabama State University. Nothing in common. Other than our wives, they both are about the same. But we have nothing in common. But we're able, through empathy, to understand one another, to develop a relationship with one another, to where, and even when he makes his jokes, that it doesn't offend me. He sent me a text the other night. Matter of fact, just the other night he sent me a text. He says, "Your son is going to be," because my children haven't seen him in a while since we moved to Panama City. And so he says, "Your son is going to be surprised when he sees his Uncle Ben." So he always sends me this Uncle Ben picture, Uncle Ben Rice, right? So he sends me a picture of that because that's what we think Uncle Ben looks like, is the black guy on the rice box. And of course, their Uncle Ben is a white guy. And so he said, they're going to be very surprised when they see that. And so because of empathy, because I understand that maybe he doesn't understand that it could be offensive to somebody, right? Then, you know, I just laugh about it, we talk about it. And then yesterday, I meet him for breakfast whenever I'm going to see my daddy in Eufaula. And so I meet him for breakfast in Dothan. And we're sitting there talking about Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima and all those other things, right? That's my timer, okay. All right. So let me wrap up with this 30-second deal, right? I'm gonna pass it, so we got this closed, right? 30-second deal. Remember empathy. You have to try to understand what the other person is going through. But you have to be honest and realize that some things you'll never understand just because we're different. But you have to start making observations and start paying attention. What's happening? What's going on? What's happening in my community? What's going on? Not just what's happening on TV and Facebook and CNN and Fox News. What's happening right here in Bay County? Make observations and then try to walk in somebody else's shoes. Right? Because that's where the empathy comes. Blacks, let's try to walk in a white person's shoes to say, okay, well, why don't they know? Why don't they understand? How can I help them understand? And whites try to walk in a black person's shoes to see, what does it mean to be black? What does it feel like when you are pulled over by a police officer, right? And I can tell you, as the mayor of Glen Haven, I still get pulled over, okay? And so it doesn't matter what position you attain in life sometimes, you can still have those fears. And so honesty, observation, and walk, that's how you can develop empathy in order for racial reconciliation.
Thank you so much. As we plan to conclude our evening, we do want to give this general conclusion here as our time comes to an end. We are hoping that we will have future opportunities because, again, we could take any single one of these topics and spend a lot of time on it. But we want to recall and remember these barriers, lack of information or disinformation, fear, and how fear is stoked. Fear of what? Fear of loss. Loss of what? Physical space. Loss of what? Loss of power. What kind of power? Power of not having to think about racism. Not having to think about racism or discrimination is in itself a type of privilege. Fear of loss of power of absorbing the pain, the anger, the shame, the guilt that goes in varying degrees through various sectors of all of us. Pain, anger, shame, and guilt are all part of this reconciliation process. And not having to deal with any of those emotions is certainly a positive thing that we would aspire to. But the institutional contradictions, the hypocrisies in our country, being able to live up to what we say we are, being able to stand tall and proud of our country as the world's leading democracy. The world's leading democracy. If we believe in the concept of democracy, then as Jesus and Abraham Lincoln said, certain things just do not go together and cannot last. A house divided against itself cannot, house divided against itself cannot stand. It will fall. And we are seeing evidence of what it means to be in a crisis situation, of something that may look like it's falling. Another barrier is closed-mindedness. Existing in information silos. So many people are only able to listen to or absorb the information that confirms what they already believe. And in the age of modern technology, it is very easy for people to exist in information silos without considering how to go out and do the things that we've talked about here tonight. So this, as we hope there will be in the future, is an opportunity, or has been an opportunity, for genuine dialogue. And although with the number of people here and the short amount of time that we've had on the subjects, we may not have been able to realize a lot of depth, but hopefully everyone was impacted in a way that we can use going forward in bringing others along on this journey. Because again, it is a journey. It's a lifelong journey for most people, and this is a continuum where at any given point, hopefully we can find moments of saying, aha. That's what makes life rich, when we can go, aha, wow, I learned something new. I felt something new. I discovered something new. I thought about something new. Another barrier, of course, we know is political extremism. Political extremism. Our lack of empathy, and also there's apathy. Now, when we started doing our program, we were concerned about, what if some people show up and they want to be argumentative about the issue of racism? Well, again, not a debate, the dialogue. But what about the idea that there are those that just, as we said, refuse to acknowledge the fact that it's an issue. What we can say to them is that we hope they'll catch up. We hope that for their sake and their children's sake, that they will at some point understand that history moves on. There are patterns in history. We can look back and see how things have changed and expect that they will some more. But this is something that we hope we'll be able to do again in the future. We've offered the booklets that we hope will be informative for people to use as tools. Hopefully this is some valuable information that you can see the evidence. We're always looking for evidence, lawyers? Where's the evidence? So we hope that we've made the case for those that may need help in making that case to their friends and loved ones about the nature of the divide. And we also hope that people are interested enough to embark on their own personal journeys toward anti-racism. Because to say that I'm not a racist is one thing. To say that I am an anti-racist is something that means you have taken a concerted effort and that you have made it a priority to take action steps to help advance our collective democracy. So the League of Women Voters is proud that we were able to put on this forum after many delays. It's great to be in a room full of you all, who most of us believe that we are in spaces with those who we know and respect. And our challenge and our charge is to expand out into those circles of people who really need this information. Hopefully all of us here could get something that we did not already have out of this, but how many do we know that we would like to be able to share with and bring them along our journey to? So hopefully everyone will look at this, and we've got some educational materials. Our book's out there primarily for display, but we do have anti-racism journals available for $5. This is Kahinde, Ibram Kahinde's workbook that goes with his book of how to be an anti-racist. We also have for sale our Women's Centennial pins at a reduced price for those that would like to help support the cause of the League of Women Voters. We are a 100-year-old organization that is proud to be part of our national group that is continuing to fight the good fight. And so because of the current nature of things, we are very busy and hopeful that you will join us. We need members. If I could, please have our League of Women Voters members that are here in the room to stand up, stand up, stand up. League of Women Voters, we have men in our League of Women Voters, and we are looking for more. We have some students. Where did my little student go? Over there. But we are definitely wanting you to help us recruit for the League of Women Voters. Our membership chairman here, Wendy Bryant, will be happy to take your memberships this evening, or to get our information so that you can forward it to us. And since we did get everyone's email that's here and contact information, we certainly will be in touch with you as we plan to continue this. We are looking forward to a party at the end of the year, but as soon as the year kicks over, we're in another election season. We get a little bit of a break. This year is considered an off year, but January will be here in no time, and things kick into high gear, and we want to be able to focus on the value in the issues before we start talking about the people. We are interested in the issues and our positions on the issues. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Please take your booklets, your candy, your well wishes toward one another, and please keep in touch. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. So God bless everyone, and thank you so much for coming tonight.